Rushed my pregnant wife to the ER after she lost feeling in her limbs. Doctors remain clueless and I'm terrified for her future. My pregnant wife works in the medical field, so she's usually the tough one when it comes to emergencies. But a couple of days ago, I got a call that flipped my world upside down. She'd hurt herself at work, and her arms were hurting and starting to go numb. She told me she'd spoken to her doctor and was waiting for them to call back. I asked her to let me know if she needed me to come get her. An hour later, she told me they thought it was probably nothing, but she wanted to go home. I rushed over to pick her up, and when I got there, what I saw broke my heart. She was in tears, she couldn't move her arms, and she couldn't feel or move her fingers. As we walked outside, I looked at her and said, "We're going to the ER." She nodded, barely able to hold back her tears. On the drive to the hospital, things got so much worse. By the time we got to the ER, not only could she not feel her arms or fingers, but now she couldn't feel her legs, either, and they were spasming uncontrollably every 3 to 5 seconds. They immediately called in a med alert crew, who helped get her out of the car and onto a stretcher. Inside, it all felt like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. The ER team checked her and did an ultrasound, and my heart almost stopped until they told me the baby was fine, a strong heartbeat. I clung to that news like a lifeline. But hours dragged by, and eventually they got her into an MRI to check out her spine, both cervical and thoracic. After what felt like an eternity, the results came back, clear. No visible signs of damage. Now we've been here for 36 hours, and the doctors admit they're clueless. Clueless was the neurologist's exact word, and hearing that scared me more than I can describe. My wife can't feel or move anything below her chest. She can move her arms up to her wrists, but her fingers, no twitch, no squeeze, nothing. The doctor says she doesn't think this will be permanent, but she can't promise anything. I'm terrified, beyond scared, that my wife might not walk again, or that she might lose the use of her hands. I'm trying to be strong for her, to stay calm, but when she finally drifts off to sleep, I find myself quietly crying almost every time. Last night, I just had to get out of that room. I went downstairs, and the weight of everything hit me at once. I ended up breaking down in front of a complete stranger. Without hesitation, he stopped, pulled me into a hug, and I found myself clinging to him, maybe longer than he expected. But in that moment, I truly needed it. If you're the praying type, please, send one our way. Update 1. We sat down with the neurologist to discuss the possibility of GBS, but both the neurologist and the doctor agreed to rule it out. Their reasoning was that what my loved one was experiencing had come on rapidly, not gradually, as GBS typically would. On top of that, her symptoms started in her hands and arms and only later worked their way down to her legs and feet. GBS, as they explained, usually begins over time starting in the feet and then moves upward. I brought up transverse myelitis, worried and searching for answers, but they dismissed that possibility, though I can't quite recall the exact reasoning behind it. Right now, they're performing a lumbar MRI to get a better understanding of what might be going on. The neurologist wants the clearest possible picture to help rule things out, so he's ordered a lumbar puncture as well to look for things like meningitis. I'm sorry this update is so short, I truly only had a few minutes to write everything down. I promise to update again as soon as I know more. Update 2. Several weeks ago, my world turned upside down when my pregnant wife had what I can only describe as a bizarre and terrifying accident at work. Out of nowhere, she heard and felt a pop in her shoulders, and suddenly she couldn't feel her arms or hands. The panic in her voice when she called me, still etched in my mind, made my own heart race. I rushed to her workplace as fast as I could. On the drive to the hospital, things took a turn for the worse. She began to lose feeling, then movement in her legs. I'd never felt more helpless. The fear in the car was suffocating. I just kept reassuring her that we'd get help as quickly as possible. At the hospital, it was a medical whirlwind. Teams surrounded her, running what seemed like every test imaginable. MRIs, ultrasounds, EEGs, EMGs, echocardiograms, EKGs, each medical term sounding heavier than the last. The only tiny bit of comfort was the confirmation that our baby was okay. In those frantic hours, it felt like time had both slowed down and sped up, my mind flipping between hope and dread, clinging to any scrap of good news. Update 3. They reached out to the inpatient rehab facility near us, but we got denied. Every place they tried in neighboring states turned us down, too. Our next option was skilled nursing, but our insurance wouldn't cover it, and it would cost $2,000 a week, with a minimum of 3 months required. And then came the gut punch, my insurance wasn't covering the hospital stay either. In the last 7 or 8 years, I've built some strong bonds with a couple of physical therapists here in town. I reached out to my neighbor, who happens to work at a different type of facility, but she knows people everywhere. She promised to see what she could find out. Another close friend, who was a groomsman at my wedding, I was one at his, too, works at a local PT place. I got in touch to see if he had any connections at the local inpatient rehab. Turns out, he was on vacation, but his wife, a PT at the hospital, was sitting right next to him. She said she'd make some calls and get back to me. Fast forward to the next day, we got an unexpected call. My wife had been suddenly approved for the IPRF, the very place that had just denied us. My wife and I were talking about this miracle, and my friend's wife came up. Neither of us really knew where she worked, so my wife suggested I Google her, and there it was. She wasn't just working at the IPRF, she was one of the top doctors there. She's the one who pulled the strings to get us in. They even mentioned that my other friend had reached out, so it must have looked odd to them that two completely unrelated people were trying to pull strings at once. After 11 days in the hospital, we were finally transferred to the IPRF. There, a new neurologist wanted another MRI. A couple of days later, the doctor came in and told us she didn't have FND. Instead, it was a spinal cord stroke. My friend and his wife brought us dinner that night, and she took the time to answer every question we had. She said we needed to transfer to an even more specialized facility. 2 days later, after a total of 13 days, we landed at the spinal rehab facility. Here, my wife is at last getting the right care, for the right diagnosis, in the right place. They expect her to be here for the next 2 to 3 months. She's pregnant and had the injury at work, not work-related, lost all feeling from her chest down, and was initially misdiagnosed with FND before the spinal cord stroke diagnosis came in. We're now at 4 weeks, with a long road ahead, but we finally have hope. It's different for every patient, for every case, but we're holding on to hope. She's starting to have spasms in her legs, even kicks. She can sense touch, but can't feel in the way she used to. The doctors seem hopeful too. They say if the loss was permanent, there wouldn't be this kind of activity. We made it into therapy within 2 weeks, and I'm clinging to the hope that we were fast enough, and that she'll get back on her feet again. Update 4. She has now been in the rehab facility for about 5 weeks, though honestly, the days and dates have all started to blend together. The facility itself is brand new, having just opened this past August, and everything inside is top of the line, brand new state-of-the-art equipment, staffed with therapists who really know what they're doing. On that front, we've been fortunate. But the nursing staff hasn't lived up to our expectations, and I've had to file complaints more than once. When she first arrived, the team ran a pinprick test on both her legs. At that point, she scored a 0. It was devastating, but 2 weeks later, they repeated it, and this time she scored a 2 on both sides. They could feel her muscles starting to activate, trying to move the legs until the spasms would suddenly take over. The PT group has been working hard with her, and after the OB team gave their sign-off, she was officially cleared for more intensive therapy. With that green light, they ramped things up. She's been working on sit-to-stands, and managed, assisted, though I couldn't tell you exactly how much, to actually stand upright, even if just for a few seconds, with the therapist by her side. She's on the bike too, assisted, but her legs haven't yet found enough strength or reaction speed to override the bike's own motion. Still, every day, there's been a little more progress. New therapy techniques are coming into play, and I've found myself marveling at her perseverance. This week, she noticed she could wiggle her toes for the first time since everything happened. Another moment, when she first arrived, they gave her 1-inch cubes to pick up. Back then, she either couldn't get a grip or found them too heavy to move. Just this week she picked a cube from one side of the box and dropped it on the other, 40 times in 60 seconds. That might sound simple, but it's a huge step. She can now even sit up on her own, head held high instead of pressed down to her chest. Physical therapists will know just how much that means. She's still having trouble with her bladder and bowels, and I think those are going to be the last things to return. We'd initially been told she'd go home before Thanksgiving, but the staff changed their minds and wanted to discharge her right after the holiday. We pushed back. Sending her home just for the sake of a calendar date didn't make sense, and now, discharge is set for December. Meanwhile, the OB team has been closely monitoring things. The baby is growing and doing well. Because of the high-risk nature of everything, they want us to come back and deliver at their facility. Their hope, and expectation, is for a natural childbirth. That's probably enough of an update for now. When there's something bigger to share, I'll be back with more. On a personal note, my husband and I went through something truly traumatic during my pregnancy, and neither of us really took the time to process it. We were just focused on moving forward, because there was a baby on the way. For anyone finding themselves in similar shoes, I urge you to take a breath, and while she's still in residential PT, consider talking it through with a therapist. Your mind and heart will thank you. Update 5. It finally happened. She stood up and took steps. Not pretty, not smooth, not without 2 therapists bracing her hips and a third guarding her knees, with a web of straps holding her in the harness and the parallel bars pinched white in her hands, but honest to God steps. They counted out loud, like you would with a child at the edge of a pool. 1, 2, 3, and I swear the room got quiet even though nothing around us actually stopped. Her right leg listened first. The left dragged and then caught up, and the way she blinked when her heel kissed the floor made me feel like I was watching someone come back into their own body. Afterward she cried in the bathroom because the adrenaline gave way to fear that it was a fluke. That same afternoon they put her back in the harness, and she did it again. The handwork has turned a corner too. A month ago, the therapist would place a spoon in her palm and we'd both hold our breath to see if her fingers could argue it into place. This week, she brought the spoon to her mouth all by herself and then scolded me for hovering. She can make a loose fist now, thumb to first 2 fingers, and the O.D. had her write her name on a dry erase board. It was crooked and shaky, but it was her, exactly hers, and she stared at it like it was a photograph of a person she hadn't seen in years. If she focuses, she can snap the corner of a wet wipe between her fingers. It's tiny, but all the tiny things seem to be showing up together like a crowd arriving late.
We had our first home eval with wth.
I never thought I'd be proud of knowing the exact width of our bathroom doorway or how many inches we'll need to clear the lip of the shower, but here I am reciting measurements. They let us borrow a ramp and a sliding board for a trial day pass, and walking her into our living room in a chair made me relearn every inch of our house. The dog went totally still when he saw her. He put his head on her lap, right next to the baby, and the baby kicked his ear so hard the poor guy flinched. We both laughed until she had to cough and I had to stop myself from trying to hold her together with my hands. We practiced transfers onto the couch and back to the chair, and she told me to quit narrating each move like I was a flight attendant. We ate takeout at our own dining table, and when it was time to go back, she asked me to wheel her into the nursery. She reached for the crib rail with those stubborn fingers and tapped it twice. It felt like a promise. The OB team has been incredible. They did a long monitoring session this week, and the baby is strong and stubborn and likes to kick the fetal monitor out of position just when we think we're done. They went over the plan again: deliver here, same hospital, everyone in the loop, and they brought in anesthesia and the rehab doctor to talk through pain management and what to watch for. I didn't know how much of labor lives in the nerves you don't think about. I do now. They aren't spooking us, they're making sure we know the map. When they were done, she asked if she could still try for what they'd hoped for the whole time, and the OB said yes without looking at her chart first. You should have seen her exhale. We've had scares. One night we thought her water broke and it turned out to be a bladder spasm and a leak. She apologized to the nurse and then apologized to me and then apologized to the floor. Later that night her toes buzzed like a carbonated drink under her skin, and she said, "Do you feel that?" And I said yes even though I couldn't. The next morning the PT pressed a pin on her shin and she said sharp before she knew she'd said it. They don't promise anything, nobody does, but the therapists keep telling me the nervous system loves repetition and stubborn people, and if that's the case she's got both covered. Insurance is being insurance, but the social worker here doesn't flinch. She sat with us and mapped out what we qualify for, what we can appeal, what we can borrow, and what we can live without for a while. Somebody somewhere decided we get a custom chair, and they measured her like a tailor: hip width, trunk height, armrest to seat, everything.
They added a tray that folds down because the OT saw her feed herself with a fork and didn't want momentum to be the thing that killed it.
They've started training me for real now, not just watch this but you do it, and I'm learning when to spot and when to step back. The first time I transferred her without the therapist's hands hovering close, I realized I'd been breathing too shallow for 5 weeks. She's not pain-free. The spasms still ambush her, sometimes her legs feel like they belong to a stranger who's trying to knock over a table. They try warm packs and stretching and timing the meds so she can sleep. Once, at 2 in the morning, I sat on the end of her bed with my palm on her calf and counted out her spasms like waves. By the time I hit 40, they eased, and she fell asleep with her mouth open the way she used to on road trips. In the morning the PT had her in a body weight support treadmill and I watched the screen as the percentage of support clicked down in tiny increments, and before I could say anything she looked over her shoulder at me and said, "Don't you dare cry." I did anyway. Discharge is still December, but now that date feels less like an eviction and more like a launch. We've got grab bars going up at home next week. Her mom is flying in to stay for 2 months, and my brother is coming over this weekend to take the bathroom door off its hinges because the chair and the frame are too close a match. The rehab team wants us back just after the new year for outpatient, and they've already put her name on the schedule like it's a reservation. When I write it all out, it sounds clean and linear. It isn't. It's messy and slow, and every small win comes with a shadow and a noise you didn't prepare for. But every night when the lights go low in her room and the monitors settle into that soft beep beep that you stop hearing after a while, she reaches for my hand with those slowly waking fingers and I feel her squeeze, and that alone feels impossible and brand new at the same time. Update 6. She was in the big harness over the treadmill, legs in those black cuffs, PT on either side, me pretending not to hold my breath at the console. She looked down first, then at me, then back down, and the PT froze for exactly 1 second before she hit a button and everything turned into choreography. Someone threw a towel under her feet she couldn't quite feel. Someone else called a nurse. The rehab doc actually jogged. They unclipped her like they were disarming a bomb and rolled the whole contraption out of the way. I walked beside the stretcher and kept saying we're okay, and she kept nodding even though her eyes were doing that bright, surprised thing they do when she's 5 seconds ahead of me. L&D was ready. The OB we know by first name now slapped her chart against her thigh and said, "You got here on your own terms," and grinned like she'd been waiting all month to say it. Anesthesia came fast. They'd already planned for an early epidural to keep her blood pressure steady with her level of injury, and the anesthesiologist talked us through it without looking away from what he was doing. They kept a toco on her belly and a line across the screen that looked like mountains building and falling. She couldn't feel the waves but she could see them, so the nurse leaned in and said, "When this climbs, bear down like you're blowing a bowling ball out through a straw," and my wife laughed and then did exactly that. We had one scare and it was the kind with a fix, which I'm learning is its own category. Her face flushed, a hard line popped up along her hairline, and she said her head felt like a drum. The nurse didn't blink. They checked the catheter and found a kink, straightened it, pasted a ribbon of nitro, and I watched her numbers climb down like someone calling a dog off a porch. The OB winked at me when she saw my hands shaking on the rail. They coached her with words instead of pain. Pull your ribs down. Curl around your baby. Push into my hand. It felt like the rehab gym got to shadow the delivery room, cues, breath, repetition. After 2 hours of that there was a vacuum cup and 2 pulls, and then there was the exact sound every movie gets wrong. The baby wasn't interested in making an entrance. She came out pink and furious and perfect and then suddenly quiet on my wife's chest, mouth opening and closing like a goldfish until it found what it was supposed to find. My wife cried before the baby did. I didn't expect to hear her say I got you in her old voice, the one from before any of this. We named her what we'd written on a post-it taped inside our kitchen cabinet months ago. I counted fingers and toes anyway because I needed the ritual. The pediatrician announced numbers I'll probably remember longer than my own birthday. Later, while the room settled into that sleepy hospital hush, my wife blinked and said, "I can feel my calf," and then laughed because it wasn't the kind of feel that means anything dramatic. It was a fizzing, an awareness like a phone buzzing from the next room. It faded. It still felt like something. They kept us on postpartum for 2 days. The rehab team kept wandering in out of habit.
The OT adjusted the bed like it was a wheelchair and taught her how to bring the baby to her instead of
reaching for the baby. Lactation sat on the edge of the bed and said, "We'll make this work with your body as it is today," and did not flinch when the baby kicked hard enough to set off 3 monitors at once. The spinal doc swung by 2, and he finally gave us the piece that clicked into the empty space we've been staring at for weeks. He said the words, "fibrocartilaginous embolism," slow enough for me to write them down. "Think of a tiny bit of disc material getting where it doesn't belong," he said, sketching a spine on the back of a meal ticket. Sometimes it's after a strain, sometimes just bad luck. Pregnancy changes what blood wants to do. It fits the timing of your pop and then numb, and it fits your imaging. He didn't claim certainty, he gave us a story that made sense. When we rolled back to the rehab floor on day 3, the nurses at the desk did a little clap like we'd brought them a cake. They'd set up a bassinet next to her bed with a paper sign taped to the side that said VIP guest. The PT showed up with gentle smugness and said, "Ready to use what you just learned about breathing?" And put her in the harness for 10 careful minutes while the baby slept on me. They let her do one stand. When she was fully clipped and the therapists were braced in their choreography, they tucked the baby against her chest for a photo. She closed her eyes and smelled the top of our daughter's head and mouthed, "Okay, okay," like she was convincing herself. Her custom chair arrived while we were still inpatient, deep teal like she picked. The rehab tech adjusted the armrests and the footplates like a tailor does a suit, and I watched her line her fingers up on the push rims and propel herself down the hall with that tight, determined look she gets when she's making her body remember. She rolled into the nursery on the postpartum floor to strangers' little gasps and came back to our room with a pacifier stuck to her sweater like a badge. There have been small, mean hours in between. The spasms still show up with terrible timing, once in the middle of a diaper change while she had both tab corners between her fingers like origami, and the leg kicked and the wipe went airborne and we laughed because we had to. At 3 in the morning last night, the baby hiccuped and my wife's quads tried to echo it, and I sat with my hand on one and the other on the tiny back under the blanket and counted the 2 rhythms until they stopped arguing with each other. She can open the tiny snaps on a onesie now if she cheats with a thumbnail. She wrote our daughter's name on the whiteboard outside our door and underlined it twice, and the underline went straight across for the first time. Discharge happened on the date they'd circled like a threat a month ago, and this time it felt like permission. Her mom is here. The grab bars are cold and honest in the bathroom. The ramp is a little steeper than I want it to be, but we make it work. The car transfer that used to take 10 minutes took 4 today. We rolled our daughter through our front door and the dog froze like he didn't trust his own happiness. He sniffed the baby first and then curled up under my wife's footplate like he was plugging in a charger. Outpatient starts next week. They've already got her in the parallel bars on the schedule, and the PT slipped me a look that said they're going to put a walker in front of her when the sleep debt gives us a day that feels generous. The OB cleared her to keep moving as long as her body agrees. The social worker mailed the last appeal with a sticky note that said don't worry about this. 1. And I am taking the luxury of believing her. It isn't clean. It isn't a miracle. It's us, in our own house, up at 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., switching sides of the bed because the transfer is easier from the left, me whispering counts under my breath like a person trying to catch a runaway train with a rope, her thumb finding the corner of a diaper tab and pulling it home, the baby making the kind of small wild animal noises that will ruin me for the rest of my life. Every once in a while, out of nowhere, her heel finds the floor and taps twice without anybody asking. It feels like a promise every time. Update 7. Outpatient felt like walking back into the same movie with a new script. They put her between the parallel bars for warm-up, the same way they always do, and then the PT slid a walker in front of her like it was a dare. No harness, just a gait belt, the therapist's hand on her pelvis, my heart beating in my mouth. Shift right, the PT said, like she was ordering coffee, and my wife's right knee locked just enough to trust it. The left leg listened late and sloppy, but it listened, and she cleared the floor with the toe and put it down where it made sense. 6 feet. Then 8. Then a turn that looked more like a boat docking than a person pivoting, but it happened, and I had to look at the baby in the stroller so I'd remember how to breathe. That night the universe reminded us there's still a trapdoor under the floorboards. She blinked and said, "Headache," in this flat way that wasn't like her because she never says things like they're facts. Her skin flushed bright above the level of her sports bra and stayed pale below it. Goosebumps climbed her forearms in a weird patchy line. We both heard the lecture from rehab in our heads at the same time. Sit her up, check everything, call for help. I propped the head of the bed, loosened the waist on her shorts, checked the catheter, and found the line to the bag folded under her thigh like a bent straw. When I straightened it, the bag filled like a cartoon bucket and her face unwound a notch, but the drumbeat in her head didn't let up. I called 911 with my thumb already dialing. By the time the paramedics rolled in, the dog had stationed himself at the bedroom door like a bouncer and the baby had somehow slept through all of it. Her blood pressure was obscene on the monitor, then sliding down in these careful steps as the bag kept emptying and they had me keep her upright. One of the medics handed me a laminated card that said autonomic dysreflexia in big bossy letters. "This stays on your fridge," he said. I taped it to the pantry door too, because I don't go to the fridge for tape in a panic, I go to the pantry. After they left, we stared at each other and said we're okay until it felt like the truth again.
The next morning the OT made her pick up pennies and stack them, and she did it with a pinch that actually looks like a pinch and not a crab trying to pick up a grape.
She signed the consent form at the pediatrician and her last name didn't slump down the hill at the end. She clipped the car seat buckle with a tiny smack click that made the nurse look up like she'd heard a magic trick. That same afternoon she texted me from the kitchen, "Come here, no rush," which is not a phrase that exists for new parents, but I went anyway. She'd braced at the sink, elbows locked, fingers white around the edge, and washed a bottle without splashing herself, then dried it with that slow wrist twist I remember from before. When she handed it to me, her knuckles weren't screaming red. It felt as big as her first steps for some reason I can't explain. Public is a whole new sport. The pediatrician's building had an elevator out of order sign that made my stomach drop, and before I could invent a
Plan B, a janitor in a green shirt waved us toward a freight elevator that smelled like cardboard and winter.
On the way back out there was a curb cut with a lip of concrete that would have been nothing to anyone else and was a small mountain to our front casters. She rolled up, lined her hands with the push rims, and popped her front wheels over it with this quick confident flick I didn't know she had yet. I made an involuntary noise, she grinned at me like she'd stolen something and then the baby squeaked and we all moved on. The physiatrist tweaked her meds this week, less baclofen so her muscles can answer when the nerves whisper, a little gabapentin to turn down the fizzing. By mid-morning she could set her quad on purpose, you could actually see the kneecap pull north and the therapist said there it is in the tone people use when whales breach. The spinal doc ordered a follow-up MRI and looked almost smug when he pulled up the images. "Stable," he said. Same thin bright line in the cord, a little darker softening where it healed wrong and right at the same time. It fits our story. FCE is still their best theory, misplaced disc material hitchhiking in the worst way, pregnancy tilting the odds. He said it with that careful honesty we've learned to lean on. Nothing changes the work. We had our first real storm since we've been home, the power hiccuped, the house sighed, and some ancient smoke alarm that we didn't even know had a battery chirp just long enough to send the baby into that hiccuping cry that breaks your chest. I was in the garage looking for the breaker panel with a phone flashlight and a wrench I didn't need. When I came back in, she wasn't in the bed. The nursery light was a square on the floor and she was there, hands on the crib rail, her chair angled 5 inches back because she'd locked it and pushed herself up. "I'm here," she said to the baby, this quiet, old voice of hers, and she shifted her weight like the PT taught her, ribs down, belly tight, breath out, and did 2 tiny heel slides that nobody would brag about in a video. She got her nose over her toes and kissed the baby's forehead and the crying stopped like a knob had been turned. I stood behind her with one hand ready at her gait belt and didn't use it. It was a second and then another second and then a third and then she sat. We both laughed the kind of laugh you do when the roller coaster slams to a stop and you still have your hat. Outpatient has turned into routine in the best way. They put a walker in front of her almost every session now. Some days the left leg gets offended and refuses to show up, some days she strings together a run of steps that looks like a person headed for a kitchen table. They added E-stim to her anterior tibialis, and when the current hits at the exact moment her brain tries, the foot clears and she says oh like she's surprised by a note in a song she wrote. She can get down to the mat from the chair with just a spot and no one at her knees, and she can get back up with a maneuver that makes my back ache just watching, but it's hers and she owns it. We went to Target on purpose. I pushed the cart, she pushed herself. The baby rode between us like a little emperor. We bought 3 things we needed and 2 things we didn't and 1 thing we couldn't justify at all, which is exactly how Target is supposed to work. At checkout, she reached up and tapped her card and the machine beeped and I realized I had braced to help and didn't need to. When we rolled out, it started to snow these lazy flakes that don't stick, the kind that make the air look soft, and she put her hand out and said, cold, not in the abstract but because she felt it, distinct from touch, a tiny wedge of temperature that belonged to her again. Insurance blinked first on an appeal and sent a letter with numbers in our favor for once. The social worker called me and said, Don't frame it, but you can celebrate, and then emailed me a list of loaner equipment we could line up through a local nonprofit. We drove across town and came home with a standing frame that looks like a spaceship and smells like Clorox. The PT showed me how to strap her in and tilt her upright and watch her blood pressure like a hawk. The first night, at home, I stood behind her while she stood in it and we watched a terrible reality show together like nothing about us was an edge case, and she said she could feel the stretch in her calves like a sentence instead of a guess. There are still the mean hours. A spasm found her hamstring at 4 a.m. and tried to wrestle the sheets away from her. The baby likes to save her longest orchestra pieces for exactly when my brain decides to dissolve. The dog thinks every e-stim beep is the doorbell. But there's also the sound of our daughter's laugh folding in on itself for the first time while my wife was doing a sit to stand at the bars, and my wife lost the count because the laugh got her in the ribs. There's the way her hand slid into mine this morning and threaded our fingers together without either of us looking. There's the heel that still taps twice on the kitchen tile, sometimes with intention now. Yesterday it tapped 3 times, and we both pretended we didn't notice until we both admitted we did.